Sorry, I had to re-record. So this slideshow is the last big slideshow that goes with the First World War, and it's just kind of like a broad overview of the main impacts and effects of what's happening during the end of the First World War. So there's a guided note sheet that you can use that can help you kind of keep track of what you should really know. Also, because I usually play my guitar every night, but for circumstances unknown to you, I was unable to. I do have the guitar going on in my hands as well, kind of like something like that. So it might show up as part of the transition, just so you know. Just throwing that out there. So the first thing we're going to start with is the social effects of the war, and there's not a lot of social effects that you'll notice, even though it seems like a type of war that probably should have a lot of social impacts. So these are like three big ones that you can generalize across kind of almost, universally across all nations. So we kind of put those ones in there, and then we'll also go into more about how, there's social impacts afterwards that are a little more long-term, but our big objective here is just kind of like the immediate impacts that you can see. So we'll talk more about those later. So there's three big ones. The first and most obvious social impact were the casualties, the number dead, wounded, missing over the course of this war, but the bloodiest that occurred in known history up to this point. You had a literal generation of people in France and Germany that were killed. Also, as is pretty common, you had a ton of people in Russia that were killed, and that continues to be a trend as you go through. And then also that bottom chart there, if you notice, you've got a lot of civilian casualties as well. So this is a war, again, this is a total war where you're going to see the civilian population impacted through bombing, just destruction of territory, Belgium, being neutral and having the Germans come through. So civilian, and then also, submarine warfare taking civilian lives as well to an extent. So again, very, very bloody, lots of casualties. I'll let you kind of stop and look at that chart if you want more, overall information. Women experience new freedoms and employment opportunities. We're going to talk a little more about that on the next slide, just to kind of go through it in a little more depth. And then this concept, and it's important to know the concept because you can use it in an essay and look like you're a genius and that you know what you're talking about, because it's a political science term called total states. So you had governments intervening to an unprecedented degree in the economy and daily life of citizens. So you had things like, and this kind of goes back to that slideshow from one of the remote Mondays a couple times ago on the home front and the impact on women that we looked at, but looking at price regulations, rationing of resources, mobilizing the economy for war, conscription as in the drafting soldiers to a large extent. So you had a variety of things. Oh, and then propaganda, sedition laws against speaking out against the war, especially in the United States. So all those things, you have what's called the total state kind of phenomena. So more a kind of movement towards totalitarianism, even within what you would think of as being fairly democratic states. Moving on. Also, would behoove us to talk a little bit more about the impact of women, or impact on women of the war. So I'll kind of run through some pretty common things. Obviously, what you see in most wars, and you will see again in World War II, is the increase in employment across all of Europe for women taking jobs, especially as men are going off to fight. This was mostly temporary. It pretty much returned to pre-war levels during the 1920s, but you would see a 10 to 20% increase in the female employment across most European countries, and the United States to an extent as well, even though it's not as long, and not to the extent, just because there weren't as many troops coming from the United States being in the war just for a couple of years. Also, just as kind of a broader trend, continue to challenge gender norms in Europe and in the Americas to an extent as well. Another big one is enfranchisement. So women were given the right to vote in a lot of places. So Russia was actually one of the earliest ones to give women the right to vote. I believe even before the war ended, that had occurred. And then some of the other nations that were involved, like Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Canada, and Britain, gave women the right to vote in 1918. Germany in 1919. So shortly after the ending of the war, the U.S. finally in 1920, and then with the 19th Amendment. So the 19th Amendment kind of like goes through and gets finally ratified in 1920, and then France, for whatever reason, 1944. Yes, 1944. But overall, you see a movement towards giving women the right to vote. So we'll move on. Again, social effects, as we kind of get into more long-term effects, will kind of make themselves present a little bit more. But those were kind of some broader ones that just to keep in the back of your mind, because we want to compare those across all different conflicts that we look at in the 20th century. So political effects are probably the ones that are most involved. So the first thing is the treaties following the war have generally been criticized for actually contributing to future instability. You'll see that as we do the Treaty of Versailles kind of like negotiation activity and look more into the actual Treaty of Versailles. But there were multiple different treaties that were signed. You can see the three of them below. The middle one, I got to double check the pronunciation. I don't want to say it wrong, but you had Saint Germain and Sèvres. I'll double check the other one. But you had what can be construed as the destruction of empires, but only really the destruction of empires for the losing side. So there's this question of like, was this a war that changed to end empires? And the answer is yes, but only the empires that were parts of the losing sides. So you have the disintegration of Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. So the first treaty was for Austria, the second one was for Hungary, and the third one was the one that was signed with the Turkish government, which was like the overarching government of Ottoman Empire. You also had the creation of new. Oh, sorry, let me back up. So why does that cause instability? Like, how is that a contribution of instability? So how do those two things relate? Well, these empires were kind of keeping everything, not necessarily controlled, but under one central authority, and therefore could be seen as being a little more stable in terms of now you've got, instead of having this brand new government all of a sudden, and people kind of being left to their own devices, or outside influences, you had one central control. So giving that up kind of created some instability in the region. The other thing that created some instability was the creation of Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. So both of those nations were nations that were created that had multiple ethnic groups that may or may not have gotten along in the same nation, trying to form the same government or one government united together, which caused problems. So even like think about today, Yugoslavia has been broken up, and then also Czechoslovakia is now the Czech Republic and Slovakia. So those things have changed. But so the creation of those nations, the way that they were, caused some instability. You also had new governments and political systems, which doesn't necessarily mean that you have instability, but because of these brand new political systems and the challenges they end up facing in the 20s and 30s, you will see more instability. So you have the Weimar Republic in Germany, which is after the Kaiser abdicates, is kind of overthrown. You have this weird transition period in Germany where they have a couple different governments, and then finally the Weimar Republic takes over, which lasts until Hitler rises up in the 1930s. You also have the Bolshevism of the Soviet Union. So when Russia leaves the war, you have the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, and then the Russian Civil War, which kind of goes on from 1917 until 1921, with the Bolsheviks ultimately taking power and establishing the Soviet Union. You have the decline of the Sultanate in Turkey. So this kind of monarchical rule over the Ottoman Empire is done, and now you have new rulers in Turkey who are fairly nationalistic, and then constitutional monarchies in a variety of other places. So you have these brand new governments and political systems kind of all over the place. And then the last thing, which is going to be super important, going into the 20s and 30s is these socialist and both socialist and far-right ultra-nationalist uprisings in many European nations. So socialism had been a general concept that had been permeating throughout European and American history up until this point. But once the Bolsheviks kind of demonstrate that it can be created as a governing system in the Soviet Union, people get really, really afraid of socialism taking over and overthrowing governments in other nations. And that not even but does play a direct role in the rise of the opposite, which are far-right groups that are ultra-nationalistic and try to really rally the public against the specter of socialism, which just causes more instability in the region over time. It's basically, if you want fascist control, just try to make the rest of the nation terrified of socialism, because they will run into the arms of far-right rulers. Sorry, that was just some extra noise. Okay, so economically, I'm going to kind of break it down country by country. That seems to be kind of the easiest way to do it, so you can make some comparisons and contrast a little bit, because this did affect different nations in different ways. So Germany, they lost a lot of land, lost a lot of people as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. So this included most of their industrialized areas. They lost a lot of their merchant ships during the war, pretty much bankrupt. They were saddled with a lot of debt, had to pay back reparations. In 1922, they were unable to make their payment, and that led to the occupation of part of Germany by French and Belgian troops. It's called the Ruhr crisis. So diplomatically and economically, that was causing problems. And then you also had hyperinflation. If you're not familiar with hyperinflation just means that prices rise dramatically over and over and over and over again, to the point that your money becomes basically worthless. So to pay off some of these debts, Germany's strategy was to just print more money, not a strategy that you should use. And that just caused greater and greater economic turmoil in Germany in the next few decades, coupled with the Great Depression that starts in the late 20s and early 30s. France, a lot of northern France, including a lot of its factories, villages, and railways and farmland, were destroyed. They also lost a lot of overseas markets as a result of some of the disintegration of these empires. The Soviet Union refused to honor any of the old government's debt obligations to other nations. So the Soviet Union was indebted a lot to France, and they refused to honor any of those debts because they said that was the old government, not this new government. So some problems between France and the Soviet Union, but that economically impacted France. And then they were in debt to US and Britain, and they were really relying on the reparation payments from Germany in order to pay those. So when Germany couldn't pay them, that caused a lot of consternation for France. So Germany and France not looking too good economically after the war. Britain, their big indebtedness came to the United States. They owed a lot of money to the United States as a result of loans that we talked about with the entrance of U.S. into the war to kind of protect those loans. Might have been a motivation potentially. We had a loss of overseas markets during the war to the U.S. actually. So because Britain was so involved in blockading Germany, a lot of the places that used to trade with Britain would rely on U.S. goods and services. So it was actually a benefit for the U.S. to the at the expense of Britain. They also began to regain some economic prosperities in the late 1920s, but then you had this little thing called the Great Depression, which kind of put that down. So Britain, again, not great. United States actually saw some good times as a result of the World War I. So yay, more overseas markets as a result of the war. They became what's called a net lender, which means they actually, believe this or not, there was a time when the U.S. actually brought in more money from abroad than it sent out. So they were a net lender as opposed to being a net debtor to other nations. So more nations owed the U.S. money than the U.S. owed to other nations. put them in a key strategic position economically to be a power in the world. And then as a result of a lot of this, the economy was growing and it contributed to the Roaring Twenties. As a side note, it also contributes to an economic bubble that occurs in the stock market, amongst other places as well, in banking and lending, but that's a whole nother story, but leads to some economic growth in the 20s. For the rest of Central and Eastern Europe, you just kind of have lots of problems. New nations were established that were used to being part of more integrated empires, so it was a little more difficult for them to separate themselves out and develop their own economies. I'll give you an example of Poland. Poland had literally been part of 3 other countries, and each part had railroad that connected to the other empires, but not to each other. So the railroad system in Poland was literally this system that connected to 3 different places, but you couldn't go from one side of Poland to the other because they had been parts of 3 different empires. So just, causing a lot of economic difficulty in the development of new nations. Hyperinflation in Eastern Europe as well, and then Austria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia actually benefited a little bit from League of Nations loans. So the League of Nations trying to step in and help out with some money in these new nations, and there were 3 that benefited. Soviet Union finally going through a civil war. Eventually, as the Bolsheviks rise to power and the Soviet Union becomes the Soviet Union, you have a shift to a centrally planned economy or socialism. So they're going to be kind of this example to the rest of the world of a major socialist government and economic system forming. So those are the big economic things. My last slide is just a graphic from, I think it's from The Economist, and it just shows some different examples of what happened to these different countries over time. I don't have a riff for this one. I guess we'll just do, I have it on mute. There you go. Okay, here's a little summary. So it's how the First World War changed the world. You can see the different colors. And what they got for you is population. So in a lot of these, you can actually see the United States benefiting or doing better as a result of this war. And again, these numbers here, you got to always pay attention to the scale. It's not actually a huge increase, but an increase in population, whereas you see stagnation or even a decrease in population in other nations over time. GDP, which is a measurement of economic productivity, is going to, again, vastly increase, not vastly, but increase quite a bit in the US, and then kind of either stagnate or decline in other nations. Debt goes up for a lot of places. One thing that's interesting is if you look at Germany's, their debt actually goes down almost to the point where they have none. And I believe that what that is demonstrating is the fact that they just printed off money to pay their debts. So again, it looks good, but it led to hyperinflation. You can see Germany's inflation right there. 300% increase in consumer prices. 100% would be a doubling. So that's pretty nasty. And then industrial production going way down for Germany and France, a little bit down for Britain, but actually Italy does actually increase a little bit, and then the United States again benefiting. So you can kind of see from these different nations who is benefiting in different ways from this chart. But I'll leave you there. Again, this objective, if you look back up at the top of the note sheet, is just to identify and be able to describe some. So it's not something where you have to like really get into the nitty gritty, but just kind of looking at overall what happened. Broad context will be helpful, especially as we go through a couple other 20th century wars throughout the course of the rest of the school year. So I'll leave you there, and we will talk later.